Bull died a couple of weeks later.
You got the best of him.
I told him, I said, he'd give me a concussion. I gave him one.
For most people, the idea of living deep in the wilderness is just a fantasy, something they imagine during stressful moments or when the world feels too overwhelming. But for Tom Oar, it wasn't a fantasy. It was the only life that ever made sense. Viewers of Mountain Men came to admire him for his calm wisdom, his steady hands, and his ability to turn danger into routine. Yet behind that rugged simplicity lay a side of Tom that few ever got to see, and it begins not with the life he lived outdoors, but with the things he chose to keep tucked away inside his secluded, off-grid cabin. When you first hear people talk about Tom's cabin, it sounds like a peaceful little place, filled with handmade gear and old tools. But over the years, a string of rumors, half-told stories, and unexpected comments from visitors have built up a different picture, something darker, something that doesn't quite fit the gentle image of the man most viewers think they know. And the most unsettling part is that these whispers didn't start with strangers digging for drama. They came from people who admired him, people who visited him, people who noticed that certain things inside his home were kept deliberately hidden away. As Tom grew older, he opened up slightly about the difficult winters, the brushes with danger, and the harsh reality of living far from civilization. But even in those moments, he spoke carefully, almost too carefully, like a man choosing his words, because the untold parts carried more weight than he wanted to reveal. And that's where the curiosity begins. Because once you start piecing together what he said, what he didn't say, and what others whispered afterward, a pattern emerges. Something in that cabin wasn't just sentimental. Something in there carried a story he rarely dared to bring up. The fascinating part is how ordinary his lifestyle looked from the outside. Leather crafting, trapping, cooking over a fire, nothing seemed unusual. But those closest to him sometimes mentioned that he kept certain items tucked away for reasons he didn't fully explain. Old traps he never used anymore. Tools that weren't practical for modern hunting. Remnants of encounters he described only as close calls. And for years, fans have wondered, what exactly was he holding on to, and why did he guard some things so carefully? That curiosity, mixed with decades of wilderness stories and secrets, is what leads us into the heart of this mystery. Because the real story of what Tom Oar stored in his cabin doesn't begin with fear. It begins with the life that shaped him. Before anyone knew him as the quiet, experienced figure on Mountain Men, Tom Oar lived a life defined by danger, determination, and a kind of independence that most people never experience. He didn't simply choose the wild, he grew into it. His background as a rodeo rider shaped his physical toughness, but it also taught him something more important. The world can turn on you in a split second. Those years of facing unpredictable bulls and horses left him with a deep respect for survival. And that mindset carried over into every decision he made once he began living off-grid. When Tom left the rodeo behind, he didn't step into an easier life. The Yaak Valley, where he eventually settled, was one of the most remote and unforgiving places in the lower 48 states. Winters stretched endlessly. Supplies ran thin, and storms rolled in without warning. This was where Tom began developing the instinct that would follow him forever. Prepare for what you can't predict. And that instinct became the foundation for the unusual items he started keeping, even before anyone paid attention to it. At first, the things he stored in his cabin seemed harmless. Old outlaw-style traps, handmade skinning tools, improvised knives crafted from scraps he found in the forest. but each of them had a story that stretched beyond simple craftsmanship. Some had been created during harsh winters when metal was scarce and creativity meant survival. Others were relics from dangerous encounters, tools that had broken at the worst possible moment or had nearly failed him when the stakes were life and death. Tom never liked talking about those situations, but the items remained, almost as reminders of the moments he refused to fully explain. People close to Tom often said he was sentimental, but not in a soft way. He held on to things because they carried weight, lessons, warnings. Nothing in his cabin was there just because. And as the years passed, he started accumulating objects that didn't match the typical gear of a mountain trapper. The kind of things that made visitors pause for a moment and wonder why he had kept them. It's from this early stage of his life that the first threads of mystery begin. Because once you understand where Tom came from, how he learned to respect danger and store reminders of it, you start seeing why some of the objects in his cabin weren't simply tools. They were memories of close calls he would rather keep locked away than retell. And that's exactly where the next chapter of this story takes us. As the years went by and more people grew curious about Tom's life, the stories surrounding his cabin became layered with speculation. Not wild accusations, not dramatic myths, just quiet observations shared by those who had been inside and noticed objects that didn't quite fit the narrative of a simple mountain craftsman. And because Tom was never the type to explain more than necessary, every unexplained object became another thread in a growing web of curiosity. Some visitors mentioned seeing older, hand-forged traps that didn't match any modern design. These weren't the tools he used in recent winters. They were outdated, even dangerous if used carelessly. But Tom kept them in perfect condition, as if he needed them for something other than practical use. A few people speculated that these were experimental traps he had designed in his younger years, during seasons so harsh that he was forced to get creative with whatever materials he had left. Others suggested that the traps were tied to moments he rarely talked about, encounters with predators that pushed him to the edge of his abilities. But it wasn't just tracks. Rumors also pointed to crude survival gear tucked into hidden corners, handmade spiked tools, worn leather strips stained by years of use, and oddly shaped knives that looked more like prototypes than finished tools. Nothing about these items screamed danger on their own, yet their purpose wasn't immediately clear. They didn't look like something a man as skilled and experienced as Tom would rely on. Instead, they felt like pieces of a past he kept mostly to himself. The most unsettling part of these accounts isn't what people saw, but how Tom behaved when the topic came up. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't embarrassed. He just redirected the conversation as though the relics didn't need to be discussed. And in a way, that silence created more questions than answers. Why would a man who prided himself on self-reliance keep equipment that had long been replaced by safer, more effective tools? Was it nostalgia, a habit, or did each object mark a moment he never wanted to forget? With time, forums and fan discussions added their own interpretations. Some believed the tools were part of emergency scenarios he never shared publicly. Others suggested they were warnings, objects he kept as reminders of what the wilderness could do when a person let their guard down. And while none of these theories have ever been confirmed, they all share one idea. Tom stored things not for show, but because the stories behind them were too personal, too intense, or too unsettling to tell casually. This curiosity set the stage for one of the most whispered-about elements of his cabin, a sealed wooden crate that only a few people have ever mentioned, and that Tom never fully explained. Among all the rumors surrounding Tom Oar's cabin, none sparked more fascination than the stories about a sealed wooden crate tucked away in a corner where almost no light touched it. People didn't talk about it loudly. It was more of a quiet detail that slipped out in conversations or forum posts whenever the topic of Tom's preparedness came up. No one claimed to know exactly what was inside. It was always described as the box he never opened or the one he kept for the worst winters. And because Tom didn't deny its existence, but never explained it, curiosity only grew. According to those who visited over the years, the crate wasn't new. Its edges were worn, the metal hinges darkened by age. It looked like something built decades ago, back when Tom was still adjusting to the brutal rhythm of off-grid life. Some said it was a kind of emergency kit from a time when storms were so relentless that he had no choice but to plan for every possible threat. Others suggested he sealed it after surviving a winter he didn't like remembering. But regardless of where the stories came from, everyone agreed on one detail. Tom didn't treat the box like simple storage. He treated it like something that needed to stay closed. Speculation about its contents is where things truly take a chilling turn. Some fans believe it held improvised tools from a catastrophic winter, gear he created in desperation when supplies were almost gone. Others think it contained relics from a predator encounter, perhaps the remnants of something he had to defend himself against. A few even mentioned the possibility of journal pages documenting nights he spent alone during injuries or fevers, when the boundary between reality and fear grows thin. None of this has ever been confirmed, but the range of theories shows how much mystery surrounded that crate. One particularly persistent rumor suggests the box contained items he found during a deep tracking trip, objects that didn't belong to him, and possibly not to anyone living. Scattered metal fragments, torn fabric, or personal belongings, weathered by Montana's brutal winters. Again, nothing has ever been proven, but the idea alone contributed to the unease people felt when talking about the box. What makes the crate so compelling isn't the fear of what might be inside, but the reason he kept it sealed. Tom wasn't someone who hoarded unnecessary objects. If something had no use, he got rid of it. If something had a purpose, he used it. But a sealed box? A box he never opened, never explained, and never threw away? That suggests the contents meant something more than survival, and that the memories attached to it were ones he preferred to keep locked away. And that leads directly into another category of items Tom kept. Ones he didn't hide, but didn't talk about either. If the unexplainable keepsakes hinted at untold stories, the rumored journal pages pushed the curiosity even further. Over the years, a few visitors quietly mentioned that Tom had a habit of writing things down, not in a formal diary, but in scattered notes he kept during storms, injuries, or long winter nights when isolation pressed in too heavily. He wasn't a man who used his words loosely, so the idea that he stored private reflections only made the mystery deeper. These pages were rarely seen, and even those who caught glimpses described them vaguely. They said the handwriting changed depending on the circumstances, sometimes steady and controlled, other times uneven and rushed. Many fans believe these entries documented the psychological side of survival, the sleepless nights when predators circled too close, the harsh storms that lasted so long they distorted time. or the moments when illness or injury blurred his sense of reality. Nothing about these theories is confirmed, and it's important to frame them as speculation. Whispers, not facts. Still, the rumors persist because they fit the emotional truth of Tom's life. A man who faced the wilderness head-on for decades must have carried thoughts he couldn't always voice out loud. Some believe the pages described visions or fears he experienced during long periods of isolation, while others think they recorded warnings or omens he believed were worth remembering. Whether symbolic or literal, these supposed notes added a haunting depth to the idea of what might be stored in that cabin. But the most intriguing part is what people claim Tom did with these pages. They say he tucked them away, not to hide them, but to keep them from becoming misunderstood by anyone unprepared for the mental strain of true isolation. If that's true, then these notes weren't meant as secrets. They were meant as markers of the emotional battles he survived. And understanding those battles leads naturally to the question of why Tom kept any of these mysterious items at all. When you look at everything Tom kept, tools with unsettling histories, relics with unknown origins, twisted gear that told silent stories, and possibly even handwritten reflections, the real question becomes, why? Why did a man who lived so simply hold on to objects that seemed so heavy with meaning? And the answer, according to those who knew him best, comes from a place deeper than fear or superstition. It comes from survival. Life in the wilderness doesn't allow a person to forget the moments that shaped them. Every close call, every mistake, every stroke of luck becomes part of a memory bank that determines whether you live smart or die careless. Tom wasn't interested in glorifying his past, and he wasn't the type to dramatize what he'd gone through. Instead, he used these objects as reminders, physical anchors that kept him grounded in a world where one small oversight could be the difference between making it home and being lost forever. Some items symbolize dangers he conquered. Others symbolize dangers he barely escaped. And still others symbolized mysteries the wilderness never fully explained. Tom never needed to talk about those moments because the objects spoke for him. They held weight, lessons, and memories that words wouldn't have captured without diluting their meaning. People sometimes misunderstood this. They saw the keepsakes as eerie, ominous, or unsettling. But for Tom, they were part of a personal map, a private compass guiding him through decades of storms, predators, injuries, and solitude. They weren't chilling because of what they were. They were chilling because of what they represented. A lifetime spent surviving moments most people will never experience. And when you see the story through that lens, the so-called mystery of Tom's cabin becomes something deeper and more human. It becomes the story of a man who lived with nature, not against it, and kept reminders of everything it taught him. Which brings us to the final thought, the truth behind what Tom stored. When you put all the pieces together, the relics, the warnings, the rumored journal notes, and the strange keepsakes, the picture of Tom Oar's cabin becomes far more complex than the simple mountain home viewers saw on television. It wasn't a place filled with random objects. It was a lifeline to memories, lessons, and truths he carried through decades of unforgiving winters and unpredictable mountains. Whether every rumor is accurate or not doesn't really change the meaning behind it all. What matters is that the items stored in his cabin reveal something viewers rarely think about: the emotional, psychological, and physical toll of living truly off-grid. Tom lived a life built on endurance, silence, and respect for forces that cannot be controlled. And every item he kept, no matter how strange or mysterious, was tied to a moment that shaped him. To some people, these objects might seem chilling. To others, they're unbelievable. But to Tom, they were simply necessary. They were markers of what he overcame and what he refused to forget. In a world where most people collect things for comfort, Tom collected things that reminded him of reality, the unfiltered truth of the wilderness he chose to call home. And maybe that's why his story fascinates so many people, because behind the calm smile, the leather crafting, and the gentle wisdom was a man who carried the weight of every season he survived. A man whose cabin wasn't just a home, but a quiet museum of a life most people couldn't endure for a single winter.